What's going on, everyone? My name is Mr. Rage22. Welcome back to my channel, and in today's video I bring you the sequel to yesterday's video, the disappointment with modern horror games. But that's just the thing. It's more than disappointment. It's a tragedy. Because the fact is, horror games are dying. The horror gaming genre is dying. You know why? Because the horror game market is being polluted with garbage-ass, lackluster, half-baked horror games that not only fail at being horror games in the first place, but you realize that these indie developers who are making most modern horror games, they don't even know how to make one in the first place, which is why they are as lackluster as they are. It's why they lack to do the very thing that they are supposed to accomplish. If you are going to make a horror game, you have to know how to properly and effectively use horror, or else your game is going to be lackluster. And that's why I am here. Because as a fan of horror games and as a fan of, the horror genre in general, I have seen all of these garbage-ass indie horror games, and I have seen how bad these garbage-ass indie developers are. They may not think they are, because of them, we're indie developers. It's okay. Our games are not supposed to be as big as the others. It's not our fault. We're a smaller developer. That's a very poor excuse, because some indie horror games are actually good. Visage, one of the scariest games of all time, was made by only 5 people. 5 people made one of the scariest and arguably one of the best horror games we have ever seen in modern times. So that is a very poor excuse. Okay, an indie developer that does not have many employees can still pull off and make a great horror game. I've seen it for myself. Unfortunately, not only is it rare to see a good horror game, it's also even extremely more rare to see a good indie horror game, since most indie devs just don't really know how to effectively and properly use horror in the first place, and this is why most indie horror games are bad. But when you see an actual good indie horror developer, you should support them, because when you see a good indie game in general, that means that that game was made by a person or a development team that was passionate enough and was skillful enough to actually go through all the hardships of being an indie developer in the first place just to make a good game. And that is true passion and love right there, because being an indie developer is hard. So the next time you see a good indie developer and see good indie games, those are the developers that you should support. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the shitty developers who are actively killing the horror gaming genre. So the first problem with garbage-ass indie horror games, besides the fact that they're garbage, is they don't even know how to properly use horror. Anyone could make a horror game, but you have to know how to properly use horror, because horror is not an easy thing to use. You have to know exactly how to effectively and properly use horror, or else it's not going to be effective for the players. If you don't know how to effectively use horror, then you should not be making a horror game. And these indie developers that you see these days, I don't think they care about that. And that's because these indie developers, they're only here to just make money. They are only here to take advantage of us passionate horror fans by making these shitty half-baked horror games in the first place. And there's proof of that, because like I just said, they don't even know how to properly use horror in the first place. But they don't even care. They don't even care about the game that they are making. Or else, they would maybe give a shit about the fact that they are not even experienced with this genre. These half-baked horror games use the worst types of horror, from lame jump scares to creature and monster designs that look like shit and are not even close to being scary. These indie developers are what is ruining the horror gaming genre. Instead of having horror games that put you in a horrific experience filled with dread and tension and downright fear, you are instead put in a situation where it is nothing but exploring, which leads to it being boring, and puzzles, which lead to being tedious and unfun. These indie horror games think that exploration and puzzle solving is what makes a horror game, which is proof that they do not know how to use horror in the first place. Horror games should focus on that very thing, horror. When people play a scary game, they are expecting to have a scary experience. An experience filled with fear, dread, and tension. Tension that is so high that it makes them uncomfortable. That is how horror should be used. Those four elements is how you are supposed to properly and effectively use horror, by putting the player in a situation, a dangerous situation, that fills them with an extreme amount of stress, dread, and tension, and downright fear when the horror aspects is ramped up, either with horrifying creatures like the ones from Dead Space, or something otherworldly like the stuff from Visage, or maybe something that's just trying to downright kill you, like the zombies from Resident Evil or the inmates from Outlast, or the grunts from the Amnesia series. Those horror games knew how to actually pull off and effectively use horror the way it is supposed to be used. These indie developers do the opposite of that. Instead of actually being clever and actually having enough patience to come up with something that's actually scary, these indie developers use some of the most cliche horror aspects in the book. I was playing this one horror game about like a ghost or some shit. You're like in a haunted house or some shit, and the ghost that stalks you has long hair and black eyes. Wow, how original. Where have we seen that before? And then we've got games like this. Hello Neighbor. You expect me to be scared of this? How did horror games go from having horrifying creatures and things that scared the absolute shit out of the people who played them to being this? You expect me to be scared of this? You expect me to be scared of some dumbass with a shovel chasing me around a house because I'm trying to break in his house? You expect me to be scared of that? Or you've got this other game where you're being chased by this, I don't know, she's like a grandma or something. We all know which one it is. It's this horror game called Granny or something. She looks like a goddamn human-sized voodoo doll that was being abused by a toddler. That's what you expect me to be scared of? These indie developers, not only do they not know how to properly and effectively use horror in their games that are literally supposed to be a horror game, but they don't even know how to make it scary. They don't know how to use horror, and they don't even know how to make their horror games actually have horror in them. Horror games are supposed to be scary. It's why you play them in the first place, to have a scary and horrific experience, and these indie devs don't even know how to properly use that very thing. They don't even know how to use the very thing that makes the game that they are trying to create. These indie developers should stop trying, but they won't because they don't even care. These indie developers are not even passionate about the games that they are making, which is why they are as lackluster as they are, because if there's no passion from these indie devs being put into the games that they are making, then obviously they're going to be lackluster because they don't even care, because that's why there's no passion in them. There's no passion or love or patience put into them, which is why they end up being lackluster, because the devs didn't even care about the thing that they were making. That's why these developers don't even know how to use horror properly and effectively, because they simply don't care. These garbage-ass indie developers are only here to bank on the cash of horror fans. aka me, and aka people who still love this genre, even though these trash-ass indie developers are polluting the market with their half-baked shit. Some of the most common tropes you will see in modern, shitty indie horror games is the fact that the horror is used in the worst way. The horror aspects, which is the thing that needs to be right. If a horror game fails at actually having horror in it, then that means it is literally failing at doing the most important thing that it needs to actually do well in, and that is having horror and being scary in the first place. These garbage ass indie developers use horror in the worst possible way. These days, these garbage ass indie developers take something as simple as some dumbass with a shovel, a human-sized voodoo doll looking bitch, or some blue furry monster who looks like he's jacking off as he's chasing you, and they turn that into something scary. But how am I supposed to be scared of something like that when it doesn't even look scary or feel scary in the first place? These threats don't even feel threatening in the first place. Hello Neighbor is a perfect example. This guy chases you throughout the game and he uses a shovel. And he doesn't even look intimidating. He looks like a normal citizen who is pissed off at some little brat trying to break into his house. Stuff like this is what these trash-ass indie devs are using to make horror games. Do I need to say more? Do I need to say more? Okay, I won't stop. I'll say more. You got this other garbage indie game called Poppy's Playtime, where they take a fucking furry-ass monster. They take this furry monster who looks like it came crawling straight out of Sesame Street, and they expect you to be scared and intimidated of that. Yeah, maybe it'll scare a fucking 5-year-old. Yeah, sure, it'll scare a 5-year-old, but is it gonna scare anyone else? No. It's like these horror games are literally being made for children, because that's probably who's making them. It's either children or foreign people. God damn. God damn. Besides the fact that these indie developers don't even know how to properly use horror, the games that they are making itself are not even fun. Not only have these garbage-ass indie games fail at actually being horror games, which is already a huge problem, but they fail at being fun games in general. Most modern indie horror games that you play these days are nothing but boring-ass walking simulators. I could sum up the gameplay for these indie horror games in 2 words. Exploring, because it's boring. Exploring is boring. The exploration is so overdone. There is literally nothing else that these games have to offer. You see, exploring in a video game could be fun, but only when it is stacked up with other gameplay elements. Whether it be objective solving, or puzzle solving, or doing other stuff. Like, I don't know, maybe surviving something scary because it's a horror game. Like, these indie games rely so much on just exploring and puzzle solving, it gets boring only 40 minutes in. And these games are only that long. I didn't even mention that. These games are not only extremely repetitive and lackluster, but they are not even longer than an hour. But you know, maybe that's a good thing. It's like even they know how lackluster and boring their games are. They're like, yeah, people are definitely not going to play this for longer than 40 minutes. Let's just make the game only like an hour, and only a half an hour long. When you have a horror game that is more about just mindlessly walking and solving puzzles, and not even being about the horror itself, I'd say that is a huge failure of a horror game, because it doesn't even have the very thing that it is supposed to be. It doesn't have the thing it needs to be what it is supposed to be, a horror game. If your horror game does not have enough horror in it, then it is already a failure. And these horror devs do not even know how to properly use it, besides the exploration. Another thing, since most indie horror games fall under the survival category, not only does it need to be a horror game in all aspects, but it especially needs to be scary when it comes to the main threat in a game. Like, the enemies, or like the monster, or whatever you want to call it. Like, like the big scary bad guy that actually puts you in the horrific situation that a horror game should. For example, the grunts from Amnesia, the enemies of Resident Evil, or maybe the enemies from The Evil Within, the Xenomorph from Alien Isolation. The enemies that actually put that fear and panic into the player itself. I was playing another horror game a couple of days ago where the scary people, or like, the ghost or whatever, there are little children who wear masks. I'm not even going to say more about that. These horror devs do not know how to use horror. These indie horror devs, not only do they not know how to use horror, but the games that they are making, like I said, are extremely boring, tedious, and lackluster. And that is the worst thing for not only a horror game, but for any game in general. Video games are supposed to be fun and enjoyable. They're supposed to be so fun to the point where you can't even put down the controller or get away from the computer even if you wanted to. That's how fun video games are supposed to be. That's why we love video games, because of how fun they are. So if you have a game that is not only not fun, but instead boring and tedious, that is a huge fail. That is the biggest sin that any game could commit. If a video game is not fun, then that means it is literally failing to do the one thing that it needs to do right importantly. The one thing that it needs to do right, it fails to do it. Just like how these indie devs fail to actually make horror games that have proper horror in them. Their attempt at horror is ridiculous. It's so goddamn bad. Like, these indie devs, their attempt at horror is a goddamn joke. Besides the shit from games like Hello Neighbor and Poppy Playtime, there are so many other bad horror games out there. So many more. They don't get horror right, and their attempts at trying to get it right are pathetic. It's a pathetic attempt, and it proves that indie horror game devs are ruining the market. And back to the gameplay part, so many indie horror games only rely on two elements: exploration and puzzle solving. Those are not the things that make a horror game. I understand that games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill also relied heavily on exploration. But you know why it worked for those games? Because the horror also worked. Those games actually had horror in them. So when you were exploring in games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, there was tension and fear while you were exploring, because that's how horror was supposed to work. And those developers made it work because they knew how to use horror the right way. Which is why the exploration actually worked in those types of horror games. Because the horror worked, which made up for the game. And it wasn't just exploration that was involved. In games like the original Silent Hill and the Resident Evil series, and even modern horror games like Alien Isolation and The Evil Within, and even Outlast, you are surviving against horrifying enemies, and those horrifying enemies is what puts the dread and tension and the downright fear into the player, which is what makes it a good horror game in the first place. And these indie devs can't even pull off horror the right way, but they can't even make good gameplay. I could sum up the gameplay again for these indie horror devs in just a few short words. Listen closely. Boring exploring and generic ass puzzles. That is all these garbage ass indie horror games have to offer, and they have nothing else in between or after. Those are the only gameplay elements you will get from these lackluster, half-baked, garbage-ass horror games. I don't even get the point. I honestly don't get the point. Being an indie developer is a hard job, because being a smaller developer means that you don't have as many resources or as much money to make a bigger game. So why waste all that time making such a shitty game? Why waste all that time trying to make a game that you have no experience with? Which is, of course, in this place hard, because these garbage ass indie devs, they don't know how to make horror, or else they would not be as boring and lackluster as they are. Those two things is not only what makes a game bad, but when it comes to a horror game, it's supposed to be no exception. Because horror games are supposed to be anything but boring and tedious. They're supposed to be terrifying adrenaline rushes that are also both fun and adventurous, that also give you heart-pounding but satisfying gameplay when you actually overcome those terrifying odds. That is what makes a good horror game. And these indie devs do not know how to pull it off. They don't know how to pull off proper horror in the first place, so why do they even try? Why do they even bother making games that are just as bad as some of the shit that you see on mobile? Hell, the mobile horror games are better than this shit. And I feel bad for the people who play on PC. There's this one horror game YouTuber that literally plays every horror game that comes out. I feel bad for him because he is basically forced to play all these lackluster, half-baked, boring-ass horror games, and I feel bad for him. But back to what I was saying. Not only do these modern indie horror games fail to properly and effectively use horror, but the gameplay itself is shit. The overemphasis on boring-ass exploration is so bad, because exploring is boring if there are no other elements. Exploring is not going to be fun if that is all you doing. A game is not fun when you are literally just pushing on your stick, just walking around and waiting for something to happen. And it gets even more boring and even leads to frustration when nothing does happen. A game is bad in general when it only relies on one gameplay element. Any game is bad when it only has you doing one thing throughout the whole time. And these indie devs who make these garbage-ass horror games do it worst. The second problem are the puzzles. God damn. Some of the most boring, generic, lackluster puzzles I have ever seen. I was playing this one horror game where it asked me to find a combination for a safe, and it made me go to 3 different rooms just to find the right combination. It took that simple situation and turned it into such a boring-ass, tedious clusterfuck. Indie horror games are trash. They are ruining the genre. They are making this genre a joke. Not only do these developers give horror games a bad reputation, but they are literally the death of horror games. The fact that it's a rare thing these days to actually see a horror game that is actually supposed to do what any good horror game should do, which is, of course, give the player a sense of dread and fear and tension and anxiety by putting them in a horrific situation. It's a rare thing to see something like that these days. It's a rare thing to see horror done right, especially when you see so many others do it so wrong. Indie horror game developers are ruining the horror genre. They are ruining the gaming genre in general. They are ruining the gaming industry by filling up the market, not only the horror game market, but the market in general, with this half-baked lackluster shit, and we need to do something about it. Let me know down in the comment section below, what do you think about these garbage-ass indie horror game developers? Like, the boring exploration, the meaningless exploration, just mindlessly walking around rooms and these boring generic-ass areas. Like, another thing, these horror games are also extremely cliche. Not only are their attempts at horror cliche and completely lackluster, but even the areas that you explore are boring. Like, there's this one horror game that looks like it was trying to be PT. It puts you in a haunted house with some generic-ass ghosts chasing you, some generic-looking-ass ghosts, and some generic-ass puzzles, and the game is only an hour long. Those are the horror games we get these days. Should I say more? Or should I give you a moment to sit in a corner and realize how depressing this shit is? If you agree with me and think that we need to put an end to these garbage-ass, lackluster, half-baked horror games from these shitty indie devs, let me know down in the comment section below. But anyways, thank you so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Exploration and puzzles don't make horror games. You know what makes horror games? Horror. A horror game is supposed to focus on just that. Horror. That's why it's called a horror game. That's why it's supposed to be a scary game. Because it needs to have horror. And that's what it should focus on. Everything else should just be something that makes the gameplay fun. Whether that be fun exploration and survival elements that make the heart-pounding and intense gameplay and the dread, fear, and panic and anxiety from the horror elements. Whether it be scary enemies or just really well done scary moments like you see in good horror games like Visage and Outlast and Amnesia. Remember the sanity mechanic from Amnesia, where every time you would see something terrifying, your character would start to slowly lose his sanity? Or remember in Layers of Fear how as you were exploring, the environment would literally change around you and you would experience these disturbing, psychological, mind-bending, horrific moments? That's what makes a good horror game. And the survival elements from games like The Evil Within and Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which offered grotesque and terrifying enemies that were hard to survive against, but also extremely terrifying looking, that actually not only put the player in a state of panicness, but also put them in a horrifying but challenging survival situation. Those are the things that make horror good. Not boring ass exploration and half-baked, tedious gameplay. We need to put an end to these garbage-ass indie games, folks. Let me know down in the comment section, what do you think about all this, ladies and gentlemen? And let me know what do you think about this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. But yeah, anyways, guys, this was Mr. Rage 22. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Let me see, do you guys want this series to continue? Honestly, I think we've already talked about everything. I might make a part 3, which will be the final to this series, because I do not want to milk this topic. I might make a part 3, might not, but let me know if you guys want to see that. If you guys want to see it, I'll make it happen. So, because, you know, I always care for my viewers and my fans. So anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and this was Mr. Rage 22 signing off. Bye-bye, guys, and play some good horror games and have a good one. Bye-bye, guys, and have a good one. Don't pay the money for these shitty horror games. It's not worth it.